What we found is that within this whole referral space, there's so much room to improve the patient experience. I was just, talking to someone the other day where they were referred, not in eye care, but sort of in limbo, not sure. Well, I'm waiting for them to get back to me. That's not a great patient experience, and we can really we can change that paradigm for our patients by making sure that they know exactly what the next step in their care is when they've been referred.
Welcome to season 2 of the Ophthalmology Experience powered by Boost Patients. Today we're joined by Marc-François, one of the early founders of Sophrona Solutions. For more than 2 decades, he's led the company's push in strategic innovation and product development, helping build healthcare software that improves patient communication and engagement for practices across the country. His background in IT strategy and corporate partnerships has shaped Sophrona's growth and focus on operational excellence and smarter technology for patients and providers. Hey, Marc-François, thanks for joining us on the Ophthalmology Experience. It's been a while for us trying to get you onto the podcast. I know we've had some scheduling snafus,
It's a pleasure.
we've been getting more popular
It's a
lately.
pleasure.
So it's
As
yeah.
I've said to many people in our circles, it's been a long, arduous task to get on your dance card in this podcast that's become so important. It's like everyone has to make an appearance. So I'm glad to be here. Thank you.
I think you can finally say you've made it, right?
There you go.
We've had the pleasure of working together for a lot of years on a lot of different things, mostly related to optimizing our referral network. And for many practices, especially ones like ours who have a very um, a very rich referral network, and we depend quite a bit on those referrals to grow our practices and for those patients to help us grow our surgical volumes. There are a lot of things to consider, and it can be challenging to keep up with it all.
Hmm.
Especially as we grow and also as compliance concerns become more prevalent. There over the past few years, or maybe 3 to 5 years now, there have been some issues with compliance and communication, and so there's a lot of things to dive into. I think it'd be good for the podcast audience to kind of understand, just to get a feel for you. And
Yeah,
so, why don't you tell us about kind of yourself? How are you? How do you work with the industry? What do you focus on
sure.
give us perspective?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I've worked in healthcare tech. I've worked in technology, software technology for my whole career. At first in retail, and then about 20 years ago, I really started working with kind of a personal vision to make it easier for patients to get care. And got involved. Started Sophrona, the company where I work. And for a number of years, we really just created tools that were in ophthalmology for patient communication. And we had about 10 years ago, a large Phoenix area practice said, hey, why these things that we're doing to make our patients' lives easier, why can't we do this to make our referring doctors' lives easier? And so I think that, for me, a big part of the last decade has been this sort of quest on how do we create a better experience for referring doctors so that they're really handing off that patient to the specialist, who will ultimately take care of the patient and take care of something that's needed. And so, so I'm the president of Sophrona Solutions and been working in ophthalmology for a little over 20 years now, always sort of on the on the software communication side. And, we've had a lot of experience looking at referrals and how they come into practices. And every practice, Guido, really values referrals a little differently. Some practices really are primarily interested in being efficient, and getting those referrals taken care of. Other practices are really interested in the relationship with the referring doctor. And I think that those are probably the practices that are the most successful growing surgical volumes through good referral management, are the ones who maybe prioritize the relationship first. And so a lot of the things that we've found ourselves pulled into is how do we make that relationship tick, and how does the technology? I think you and I've talked about this high tech and high tech. How do we make sure that a referring
Right.
doctor can do things however they like with high touch or super efficiently through technology?
You mentioned making it easier for the providers, and in my experience, that's one of the most challenging things, is because there's so many providers have different workflows and just different situations that it's hard to account for every situation. So I think there needs to be a level of flexibility in the approach that you take towards working with that referring doctor. Can you talk about some of the ways that successful practices use flexibility in how different let's just talk about ODs specifically,
Yeah.
as far as referring ODs into ophthalmology offices. Like, what are some of the things that a practice needs to consider in terms of provider flexibility?
I, I think flexibility is something that we missed early on. We thought we'd figured out, well, like everyone will want to do it the best way, so let's just build the best way.
Yeah, yeah,
That's probably the hubris that comes with a lot of software companies. And we really realized that really for this to be a successful solution for an ophthalmology practice that values referrals, it really has to work for the referring doctor, however they choose to send that referral through. Whether they want, they may want to sit down and take time to check that patient out and make the appointment for them and hand the patient that appointment. And that, to me as a patient, that's the probably the best
yeah,
experience.
yeah,
But there's some
yeah,
referring practices who are just simply too busy and they just want to click, send from their EMR, or they want to scribble on a piece of paper, or they want to text their
sticky note.
liaison.
Yeah,
And so flexibility is really important, and the extra benefit that we've found that we get from flexibility is we get every referral in one place. And so now all of
mhm,
a sudden you're able to track things like, well, how long has it taken a practice to get back, get that patient scheduled or reach out? And so the flexibility has kind of led to this other value. Um, One of the things that we missed, Guido, early on was, again, we were kind of focused on making it easy to get that referral, which of course is what the ophthalmology practice wants. Like, I want more
mhm,
referrals. But what we found is that what the referring doctor really wants is they want to know what's going on. And that's what feeds more referrals, right? Uh, in a referral channel, silence kills, right? If you're not telling the referring
right.
doctor, hey, I got your referral, hey, I tried to reach out to your patient, hey, I did get your patient scheduled, well, why would they refer to you? As one optometrist put it really eloquently to me, she said, I know some practices, if I refer to them, it's crickets. And she's not interested in
Yeah.
referring in that manner. So,
Yeah, and to that point, right, it's like if they wanna know what's going on, there has to be some mechanism for them to be able to see what's going on, because the reality is that our liaisons and our teams are not gonna be able to keep them up to date and text them, "Hey, I saw patient Jane Doe in the office today." That's just not realistic for large volume practices, really any practice as busy as we're getting. So there has to so when you look at the reason I think that's important is to understand, right, the entire workflow for the optometry office, and then once that referral comes into the practice with the flexible methods that we discussed, whether it
mhm.
be electronic through a portal or it's a fax that comes into the portal. Now, from the staff perspective, how do we how do we give them visibility and then give the OD visibility into what's happening as those steps are occurring in the practice, which is key. And I know you guys help people solve those
Well, yeah, I
problems.
was gonna say, I mean, you're right that, like, we're talking about the visibility to the OD, but in many practices, a busy practice, oftentimes visibility is lost for management. It's like, well, how many referrals do we get this week, and how many of them have we actually how many patients do we contact, and how many get scheduled, and there's just uh, for many practices, it's just sort of assumed to be working well, or assumed to not be working
That's
well, and
yeah,
we're getting by, but
yeah. I'm
it's
guilty of that assumption, I tell you.
yeah.
And I think we all are, because the assumption is that, yeah, our teams are referrals are coming in, our teams are reaching out, they're reaching the patient, they're getting them scheduled. And I think in most practices, if you dig deep enough, you're going to see the reality is not that black and white.
Yeah. Well, and we both know from a management perspective that things that aren't real visible to our peers and our teams are often those things that we can easily deprioritize, right? I mean, we prioritize the things we know that people are noticing or watching or waiting. Someone is waiting for me to do this,
Mhm.
and so when staffs are short and busy, and someone's out on vacation, and you're coming back today, I'm back in the office from Thanksgiving break, and what do I prioritize? Well, it's the stuff that I know
Right,
people
right.
see and are waiting for. So yeah, what we found is that within this whole referral space, there's so much room to improve the patient experience. I was just talking to someone the other day where they were referred, not in eye care, but sort of in limbo, not sure. Well, I'm waiting for them to get back to me. That's not a great patient experience, and we can really we can change that paradigm for our patients by making sure that they know exactly what the next step in their care is when they've been referred.
Yeah, and I'm glad you brought up patient experience because that is a to me also a critical component of a solid handoff because many times patients are either unaware or just they can't really remember, who they're being sent to, why they're being sent.
That's my
And
mom. That's
so
my mom just from last
yeah,
week.
it's just a reality of that. So having some kind of systematic approach to making sure that the optometrist is sending to the ophthalmologist a particular ophthalmologist, especially in a multi ophthalmology or surgeon practice. Hey, let's say I'm an OD and I prefer this surgeon do my surgeries. Okay, that's number one. Where does the patient want to go? So, how do you, all those nuances of that referral process have to be understood because otherwise, when the patient can just show up in the office and, like, yeah, I got my doctor sent me, I don't know why. And then you're standing in front of him looking at, like, well, I don't know why either. Let me try to let's try to figure this out together, but really understanding kind of how to make it so that the ODs have the opportunity to make those, why are they coming? What do they want them to be seen for? And then have that translate into the patient's appointment to make that patient's experience a little better
Mhm.
is critical, right?
That's right, and what we also find is that the referring provider is maybe still more in the picture in the patient's mind than you think. If you're an ophthalmology practice and you're getting these referrals, you may think that once that referral is made, that the patient's sort of in motion, they're sort of like on their way to you. But in reality, they may be calling back the optometrist saying, "Hey, I haven't heard back from the surgeon you referred to yet. What am I supposed to do?" And so the optometrist is still perhaps much more involved in what's going on than you think, and they don't want to be in the, I don't know what happened,
Yeah.
Mr. Piquet. I sent the
Yeah.
referral through, and they don't want to be in that situation either. And so what we've seen is when things go really well, for practices that are really doing these things well, they have liaisons who have built good relationships. With their referring doctors, oftentimes practices having made substantial investments in liaisons who've been there for a long time, and so there are these long-standing relationships in the community. There's a
Mhm.
good technology backbone for the passing of the referrals back and forth between the referring doctor and the ophthalmologist. There's a sharing of information, clinical and what's going on with my patient? Hey, my patient no showed. No, it's not that I forgot to update you. So so you kind of have these layers of real human relationship that again, I'm kind of talking about the best practices here around referrals
Yeah.
and then being able to have the ability within the ophthalmology practice to say, hey, what's going on here? We got 50 referrals last week. Have we scheduled them? That the whole concept of speed to lead, right? Especially if we're talking about refractive things, you want to know that when that referral comes in, you've got someone. But what would you say that ideally they're calling within the hour, within the 30 minutes, you know, uh,
Yeah.
to make sure the patient, who's expressed interest and intent is being approached at the right time and not tomorrow or a week later when life has happened.
Yeah, because life happens, quite frequently. I mean, in the case you mentioned, let's say that, like, they schedule the patient or they refer the patient, the practice schedule the patient, life happened, they canceled. Now what? Now that that loop is potentially broken if you don't have a methodology to keep track of that particular patient. And I'll give you another example too that I've seen in the past, and it can be challenging, which is the the optometrist sends a patient, but maybe the patient was like, yeah, yeah, I thought about it, kind of thing, but they're not really ready to book right away. So if you don't have a solid referral workflow and platform to then house that person,
Right.
then there's no connection to that. So then 6 months later, the patient calls in and said, yeah, I'm thinking about having LASIK surgery, or I thought about having cataract surgery. And they say, okay, great. How'd you hear about us? Oh, I Googled you. And then the patient has surgery. So I've seen this too. The patient has surgery in that same situation and then goes back to their optometrist for annual exam and says, "Oh yeah, I had surgery at the practice last year." And the optometrist says, "What?"
Right.
And it's then you go back and you do the research, and it's like because they didn't say it, and
Yeah.
it was 6 months later, and our call center team didn't ask, or, something happened that broke that connection, which is super important as far as keeping the connection with the continuity of the optometrist, the ophthalmology practice, and the patient to make sure
Mhm.
everyone's, at the right spot at the right time.
Yeah.
So, how do you think practices can solve for that challenge that I just mentioned?
Well, I think that the whole question of transparency of sharing information is what we've found to be most effective. And granted, as a practice, you have to have sort of this value that, um, you really want, you really don't, you're not trying to take your referring doctor's patients as your own patients, right? You're trying to provide added value, shared value for that patient. And most practices have that good intention, and then it's a matter of how well are they executing around that. But when you're sharing information, where you're making the referring doctor feel comfortable that, like, hey, I can share with this practice all of my patients who have these interests, and when the ophthalmology practice feels like they can share with the referring doctor, like, hey, these are all the appointments that your patients are making with my staff. I'm going to share it with you open book. You don't have to fret about knowing, that I'm going to somehow try to steal your patients, right? We hear this kind of accusation of stealing our patients, and we want to make sure, and I want to be clear here that, everyone needs to do their part to make sure the patient has full agency over where they're getting their care, right? No one's trying to, like, tilt the tables in any manner, but what breeds suspicion is when information is not being shared. Like, hey, I haven't heard back what's going on with my patient. Or like the example you just mentioned, like, how did that happen? How did how did
Yeah,
they get care with your practice without me being involved or in the loop? And so I think that, and frankly, as we look at look at the future a little bit, aging population, fewer providers able to do surgery, we really have to find ways to distribute the patient care, if you will, where the surgeons can do the specialty work and the optometrists can do the primary care work the most efficiently. And that happens with information sharing, right? That doesn't happen with people trying to hold their patients in their corner.
right.
Um,
And I guess where you guys come in, and I guess your expertise is helping make that conversation more efficient, right?
Yeah. Yeah. As a colleague of mine once said, information wants to be free, and it's sort of like this idea of, like, we want to make what's going on with the patient here within the ophthalmology practice available to that referring doctor so they see what's going on. And this bears fruit, right? We now, we've been doing this for 10 years, and we have some of our very largest customers have large referring bases. And they can see that even those who they thought were their top referring doctors are now referring more than they did before, right? And providers who weren't referring start referring because they want to, this is a currency for the referring doctors. This idea, like, hey, if they share information with me, that makes my life easier. I'd rather just refer there all the time. I'm kept in the loop. I know what's going on. It's easy. I don't have to wonder what happened to my patient. I can always kind of check in and find that out. The liaisons, practice of liaisons now have this great way to also be abreast of things without having to drive back to the office, log into a system, or
Mhm.
whatever hoops and hurdles they have, they have access to that same information. So there's really a great virtue to having this information available to everyone, um, all the time and in real time.
Quick break brought to you by Boost Patients. If you're listening to this podcast, you're probably a physician, a practice admin, or maybe someone on the marketing team, and you really have a singular goal. You want new patients, more consults, higher surgery volume. And oftentimes, when you want that, you think immediately about marketing, spending more on marketing, investing more in marketing. Maybe, but probably not. We've mystery shopped over 600 practices, and there's one commonality with all of them. They're not very effective and not very good at patient follow up. So before you invest more money in marketing and more into that investment, you really need to understand how your practice is following up with new patients. So go to boostpatients.com, fill out the contact us form, and let me know that you want us to mystery shop your practice. We'll mystery shop it. We'll document how your practice follows up with your new patient lanes, and we'll share that information with you. Now, back to the show.
And all of that helps, and I think the way to encapsulate the point of that is that communication is key. Like you said, communication or the lack of communication can quickly kill relationships. And so when a practice is looking at how to shore up the referral process and how to grow the referral network, the systems at which whatever that is, I mean, if let's say that they want to get a notebook and have a colored tab system that they're really good at, then so be it. And but just make sure that whatever system that you use is going to be able to account for growth in volume, for flexibility in receiving referrals, to have constant visibility of what's happening in the network, and also give the ODs visibility, to give the liaisons visibility, and for it to be efficient. And I think like a practice of our size, obviously the example of a notebook with colored labels is not going to work. There's just too many. There's too many coming in. So I think then at this point, we start talking about technology. And so when it comes to because we're the source of truth for most of what happens in our practice is the EMR, right? That's everything that comes in and that we do. However, there are systems, external systems that have to
Right.
feed into that. So how important is when a practice is to looking at some kind of referral system or how they're going to do it, to look at technology integration, and what does the role of integration and play in that whole process? Can you talk about that a little bit?
Well, yeah, I think that, different vendors have sort of approached this differently. And the challenge, I think, the challenge and the opportunity, I suppose, for
Mhm,
a typical practice management system or EMR vendor is that the referred person is not really a
mhm,
patient until they get scheduled. And so there's sort of, and this is the same challenge that, practices who, do a lot, direct to consumer marketing around refractive procedures have, is that they have these patients they care about and these relationships they care about that sort of live outside and around the core systems of the practice. And so, you know, you know, our view as a software vendor is really to have kind of tried to step into that space and say, well, let's do a really good job of managing these referred patients who may or may not get scheduled, who need to get scheduled, and until they're scheduled, they're not really going to live anywhere else. But I think that some of the smarter practice management system vendors, also kind of see that challenge of, okay, how do we create mechanisms to um, to identify someone who may need to be a patient through tasking systems, in some cases, or through sort of partnership again with some CRM vendors. But it is a
mhm,
challenge, and so therefore, I would say, back to your question, like those integrations are really important because you do want the two to work together. You don't want to be copying out of an Excel. Like oftentimes we'll find a practice has sort of been using an Excel sheet outside of their practice management system as their sort of, or, online form, a Google Doc type things where they're tabulating. It's not terribly different from your colored notebook where they're kind of keeping that colored notebook on the side and then eventually saying, okay, now I made that patient appointment. And so,
mhm.
we haven't talked much about this, and we may be about at the end of our time, but there's a lot of efficiency that can be done, that can be brought to bear once you sort of systematize all these things. So if the referral is in the system, no matter how it comes in, now we can automate things like, well, let's create the patient in the practice management system. Let's put the appointment in the practice management system, and so on. Um,
which I think is key. And I kind of teed you up, and then you delivered right at the end as far as putting the patient in the practice management systems is, you know, because it's the synchronization of these disparate systems, like you said, is, you've got this little bucket of patients that are referrals. And so sometimes, and many times traditionally, those patients are sitting in that bucket until they schedule an appointment. But the problem with that approach, in my opinion, is that example that I gave. What happens if the patient that 6 months ago they got referred in and they're sitting in this notebook?
yeah,
Let's say they call into the practice and they get somebody on the phone, and they're not going to go back and look at the colored notebook to
yeah,
see if that was a referral.
yeah, yeah,
Like, so having a system that creates has an integration, and then as soon as that referral comes in, because that's, I think we've used that with some optometrists who are a little bit hesitant, like, well, I don't have the time, or maybe my staff doesn't have the time to get this information into a portal. I say, well, fair, but know that if your concern is visibility and making sure that your patients are sent back to you,
yeah.
if you put that patient into the portal on your own,
Uh,
when it comes over to the system, it's going to be marked with you as a referring provider. Everything's going to be marked so that even 6 months down the road, when that patient says, "Oh, I don't know that doctor who sent me," well, we're going to pull it up in our practice management. We're going to see it,
yeah.
right? And,
Yeah,
and to
well,
me,
that's a
that's
great
really
point, because ultimately, when your staff is receiving, in a typical practice that doesn't have a system dedicated to this, they're maybe doing a good job of asking the patient, "Hey, who referred you?" and then doing the extra clicks to set that up from the system. But it's really just about, at that point, it's really about information. It doesn't really affect the patient's care in the clinic, so it can easily be sort of dismissed as like, well, I don't have time for those extra clicks or whatever. And so for sure that,
right.
yeah. And Guido, you're assuming that people even keep that little book clean with like, here are all the referrals I got this week. But I think in many practices they'd say, well, I don't know, someone's supposed to scoop them off the fax machine, and then someone puts them in a folder somewhere, and uh,
Yeah, it's true.
they get lost that
Have you
way.
seen? Do you have any cool? You don't have to name names, but any horror stories or things you've seen as far as like walking into a practice, like, oh my goodness. If you don't want to answer, you
No,
don't have
I
to
mean, I
answer.
think
But
I
I'm
think
curious.
I think the anecdote I refer back to is really sort of this large practice in the Northeast that had said, it took us 6 months to realize our top referring doctor had stopped referring to us. And this is the sort of thing where, okay, if all the information is in one place, then you easily see, you easily notice these things. But without a system in place, I can see how, unless someone's asking the question like, "Hey, who was our, who did Doctor So and So refer again this month?" I mean, uh, so yeah, I'd
True.
say that's probably the horror story. And how do you rebuild that? Um, I think oftentimes,
It might be too late
oftentimes
at that
practices that we
point.
talk to fall in two categories. One is they don't really think referrals are that important, and I think they're kind of missing an opportunity, or they do realize it and they just know that they really need to do something better about it. Hey, we're only getting half of our referrals scheduled, because of X, Y, and Z, or we alienated these referring doctors and they stopped referring to us. How do we regain their good graces by sharing more information with them and that sort of thing?
Or you're category 3 like us. We know it's important and we do something about it, right?
That's right.
Top
That's
1%.
right. That's right. And you're always looking to improve. Absolutely.
That's right.
Um,
So you mentioned visibility. I think that's a good segue into data and reporting. So what are some key data points that a practice that is growing their referral network, or any practice for that matter, what should they be watching in terms of data points?
well, I'd say one of the newest data points that practices are more mindful of is really that idea of, how what's the average amount of time it takes me to get that first contact with that patient or getting that patient scheduled. Because once you start looking at that, you can start making decisions internally about like, well, Let's have someone, do this more often throughout the day or all the time, or let's dedicate a staff person. But so average, average amount of time to first contact, average amount of time to getting the patient scheduled. Um, the conversion rate, of course, what percent of patients that were referred get scheduled, the sort of understanding what the reasons are, the top reason patients don't schedule. When you do reach
Mhm.
someone, they decline. Um, those are really probably the top metrics, and then as I alluded to earlier, the idea of like, well, who are my top referring doctors this month? Has that changed? Are some of my, who are my weakest referring doctors? Has that really improved? If I have liaisons, I want to recognize their contribution to making a difference.
I don't know if you have any data, and if not, maybe we should partner together to get it. But I'd really be interested to know, when you look at that first contact, what are the, and then let's say that it took them a day versus 30 minutes versus 4 days. What what percentage of patients book at the different intervals? Like, what are the, how far down does your probability of booking the
Sure.
patient go down the longer that it takes?
Yeah.
Because I think that's
No, we should
a
look
key
at that.
thing to
That's
look
that's
at.
not something we've done. I mean, I think another question that's come up that is interesting is this idea of um, premium conversion rates on cataract consults by referring doctor, and sort of being able
Mhm.
to kind of tie together this idea of like, are some referring doctors not doing as much as they, I should put it this way, can we better educate our referring doctors to better prepare the patient when they come in to see us for cataracts, versus and so that to me would be a very interesting thing as well, sort of in that same vein as you kind of look
Yeah,
at.
and you mentioned the example of not knowing for 6 months. I think that one too, the ability for us to continue working to get that information in front of the management, in front of the liaison and the team handling referrals, so that we can take quick, actionable steps to
Right.
figure out what's going on sooner. Those are things that we a practice should look at and
Mhm.
work with vendors to try to continue that, to improve the visibility on that. But that's really key to understand what's happening in your network as well.
That's right. And I think the
I really
liaisons care a great deal too. Hey, am I making a difference? Right.
Oh, for sure. Absolutely.
Who's picking up where, hey, I just visited that practice before Thanksgiving. What's December going to look like? Kind of thing. Did that make a difference?
Let's touch briefly on compliance. So there, I mentioned it earlier, but there's different things that a practice needs to do in terms of compliance, paperwork, patient disclosure, transfer of care agreements.
Right.
How can a practice that's looking to be more compliant improve that by having a good referral system? Like, how is that going to help them?
Well, I think that's a good question. The transit, from a pure compliance perspective, as that relates to metrics being tracked, it's really important to continue using your EMR to return, to complete the transition of care by sending the transition of care summary. Now, the reality is a lot of doctors don't get those, but from a
Mhm.
compliance perspective, you need to be doing that so that you're getting your EMRs keeping track for you. You get that with your, with your MIPS scores and so forth. Um, from a like a looser perspective on compliance, I mean, I think, and I don't know if maybe let me know if I'm taking the question in the wrong direction, but as it relates to sort of, providing perhaps inappropriate incentives to referring doctors to refer to you. Um, of course, there are plenty of cautionary messages just even from last few years, but I think that, being easy to work with is a good way to make to make yourself more attractive to referring practices without doing anything untoward. And so that kind of comes back to this idea of
Yeah.
information sharing. Um,
Well, I think kind of where I was going with that is, let's say the difference of a practice who doesn't have a system
mm,
and let's say they get a phone call, and oh, my such and such sent me. Okay, great. There's a documentation. there's not great, not a great process in
Uh-huh.
terms of documenting the referral, getting the note back, making sure it's marked as a co-managed patient, and then all of a sudden, there's in the patient's ledger, there's a $300 cutout for a check to
Yeah,
some outside party versus, you've looked at your workflow, you have a tool to be able to receive the data, send the data, keep everything documented, not obviously not taking payment on behalf of them or cutting checks or anything like that. And keeping everything separate from a documentation standpoint helps prove that there's an absolute co-management agreement and that every party is doing their part and there's
that's right.
nothing shady going.
That's right. Everything is accounted for, and all the communication is transparent there. Um, and so I think that's helpful. I think that helps create order, and is really valued really by both parties. Um,
And what if you can't get, because I mean, I'll tell you, my friends, one of the hardest things of my life is to get people to do things that maybe they don't want to do.
okay.
As a parent and as an administrator with provider, that's why I have no hair, because that's the toughest thing is getting people that want to do, right? And so you probably have the same
Yeah,
problem.
maybe we have the same problem.
Uh, so how do you get, I think when you look at a referral process and you are working with not only your practice and getting them to do it, I think that's probably easier to do than trying to get outside referring doctors to change how they do it. So setting up a system, I'm going to go back to the word flexibility. Let's talk about faxes because there's so much faxing in healthcare still. It blows my mind when I see our fax bill every month that goes through our EHR. I'm like, I cannot believe there's this many faxes that come through. And we've gone through all these MIPS things and all these
Yeah,
compatibility and
yeah,
EMR and CCDA, and there's still tons of faxing. And that's just the reality of it. Why? Because it's easy. People just walk up to a machine and hit a button.
yeah.
So how do you you talk about you can talk about how Safrona does it. How do you address practices that don't want to change their workflow and they just want to send you a
Well, I
fax?
think, I mean, I think it does come back to that. We've tried, and we continue to try, and we continue to find. I mean, AI phone agents creates another new avenue, right, for how referrals will move through the healthcare system, and there are probably other AI players as well. And so we have to continue to be flexible, realizing referrals will continue to come from different ways, and people will continue to want to send them however whatever makes sense to them. Um, and as it relates to faxing, you're right. It's the least common denominator. Pretty much everyone can do it from their system, and we've sort of chosen to embrace and maybe sort of co-opt, I guess, like embrace and then make the most of it. So if we do still we track in our metrics what percent of referrals come in via fax for our customers, and for some practices that's still 80% of their referrals are coming in via fax, even when all these other methods are offered. And
Mhm.
so it just becomes really important, kind of coming back to your point, like, well, how do we meet the referring doctor where they, if we want to be efficient internally and we want to be uh, referring doctor friendly externally, we have to sort of figure out ways that marry the two. And so we built solutions that embrace, uh, intake faxes, and then provide really, really efficient ways for practices to then get those patients scheduled. Right. And so that's
Mhm.
sort of without really putting any change demands. So that, there we're not even asking the referring doctor to change. But then we are sort of, I think, trying to use the carrot, right? And say, well, if you take a moment to log in here, you'll be able to see what's going on with your referred patients. You'll have to get to the clinical data that you want,
Mhm.
or that you wonder, how it got misplaced in your office when the fax came through on your side. And so I think that's where we see sort of behavior change, and we see people sort of wanting to do things differently. There are some people who are totally opposed to using fax just on principle, and they tend to be younger people, but they're, don't want to use it. That's great. Um, and I mean, we could talk about, I think the AI phone agent question is really kind of interesting because it kind of gets at like, well, what does the referring doctor, what is the effort they really want to put into this? Is it one click? Is that all they, if they had it in their ideal world, would it be
Oh,
one click? If that's the case, then the phone agents know
yeah,
better than fax.
right. Well, I think because I think it's funny we're developing, or our practice management companies are developing tools, AI tools to handle faxes.
That's right. That's
So
right. That's right. And that'll just
you
faxes
know,
will remain sort of the
it's funny.
protocol, the underlying protocol.
I mean, if you think about it, that's really a contradiction that you're developing an AI tool to handle a
Yeah.
fax, which is the reality of where we are in healthcare, right? But it's kind of funny to me, actually.
Yeah. Yeah.
But that's it's where we are, and so we have to, in order to compete, we have to meet practices where they are, and if it's to save our staff time and to make it more efficient, if that AI can then ingest the fax, kind of interpret the data, OCR, whatever, scrape data off, try to put first name, last name,
That's
and
right.
try to pull up with
Yep.
information off the field. It's going to make our team's jobs more efficient.
That's right. I think you'll continue to see that. And of course, you know, the all of the information for a referral is already at the fingertips of the referring doctor without them having to, they would rather not retype or restate or reverbalize. They'd rather just send, and whatever
Yeah.
that looks like is what they're going to do. Um, yeah,
I think I've been not on this topic, but on many other topics. This has been coming up, like on patients. How likely are they to come back in? And this term keeps coming up. The law of least effort. I think I'm gonna get a T-shirt that says the law of least effort. How can I help? How can I help you figure it out? Because it's just kind of there's so many challenges as human on a daily basis. I think people are just like whatever's easiest, I'll just do that because
that's
there's
right.
just so many priorities in a person's day.
Yeah,
Um, so, Marc-François, if you were, let's say the practice called you and they're like, "Hey, you know what? I'm trying to get my referral network off the ground, and I'm kind of struggling." And what's one thing that you would say? Hey, if you want to start getting your hands around things, start with this one thing. Does anything come to mind for you?
well, I think a practice kind of probably needs to decide if they want to invest in a liaison, if that's too much, or if they want to invest in some technology. I mean, ideally, we would say if you really want to do referrals well, and you have a market, if you will, of enough referring providers, then you'd want to do both. But if you really just want to get started first, I think I'd probably come up with a way to try to start keeping track of, hey, how many referrals am I getting, right? And that might be, hey, I'm gonna have my phone schedulers have a post-it notepad and count sticks, and just 1, 2, 3, 4, crosshatch for 5. How many referrals are we getting per day? I can't tell you how often we will have an introductory conversation with the practice, and they don't really know. They don't really know, and so without knowing even that, it's hard to know, well, how much, um, if I'm
Mhm.
getting 20 a month, and maybe letting 2 cataract consults get by me every month, then that, it kind of gets you oriented around, well, how much money should I spend? What's the opportunity for me to, if I do this better? So I think I'd say something like that.
Yeah, it makes sense. Appreciate Marc-François coming on, sharing your expertise, and really really enjoy the I've known you for a good amount of years.
Yeah.
So thanks for putting up with me over the years and all the challenges I throw up at you. It's always fun.
Yeah. Thank you, Guido.
Yeah,
It was great to be able to talk about all these different things here. And I think there are a lot of exciting things to come, really, as you touched a little bit on getting more and more metrics around the practices within a practice that need to be employed to maximize getting those referrals scheduled. And of course, I think some of the different things that AI will do with fax reading and phone
mhm.
processing and getting patients scheduled are all exciting things we'll probably see over the course of the next year, being adopted widely. So
Don't tell my liaisons, but maybe we can have AI liaisons out there
I
with you.
don't know.
That would never work.
All right. Thank you.
Awesome. Well, thanks for joining, Marc-François. Thanks again to our listeners for joining us today. If you want to keep up with the podcast and interesting conversations with our guests, don't forget to subscribe and please share us with your friends on social media. Another shout out to Boost Patients for producing the podcast. Boost helps ophthalmology practices get more new patients without spending a dime on marketing. You can learn more about them at their website at boostpatients.com or check out the show notes. Hang in there, ophthalmology gurus. We'll get through this experience together. Have a great week.